Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Strategic Programs at Illuminate. Thank you for joining us today from all over the world. Illuminate is a hub for Jewish activism, leadership, and philanthropy, the donors and the doers, fueled by our shared determination to create a more just and equitable world in which all people are afforded the resources and opportunities to achieve their dreams. One of our signature initiatives, The Collective, is an active, ongoing community where visionary entrepreneurs and leaders collaborate and offer each other strategic support and advice. We nurture these transformational leaders. We call them jewels, Jewish entrepreneurial women, executives, and leaders, by providing financial resources, fostering relationships, and offering educational opportunities that both inform and inspire. This cadre of multi-generational women tackles a broad range of issues affecting women and other marginalized communities throughout the United States, Israel, and around the globe. Welcome back to our monthly Crown Jewel Conversation Series, where we learn from and interact with these bold and creative leaders. We believe that the integration of activism and philanthropy is essential to social change, and that greater impact can be made when philanthropists and activists intersect to form a true partnership. These relationships are vital, deserving, and in need of nourishment, inspiration, and elevation. It is not only about financial resources, but also about intellectual and spiritual generosity. When women step forward to solve big problems, history can be made. We are all visionaries, whether we are the donors or the doers. We are the antidote to despair, frustration, and anxiety. Alone, we are a drop in the ocean. Together, we are a wave of change. When you support Illuminate, you not only support 40 organizations, soon to be 50, run by phenomenal women, you are supporting a movement. Our conversation today will allow you to get to know more deeply one of the incredible women in this movement. Sarah Levin is the executive director of Jemena, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. Since she assumed this role in 2010, Sarah has conceptualized and developed a number of campaigns and projects for Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews to explore, preserve, and protect their heritage, identities, and experiences. In partnership with a multitude of organizations and activists, she is proud to continue leading domestic and international efforts to pursue acknowledgement, justice, and redress for Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Sarah is a proud Turkish, Sephardic, and Ashkenazi Jew. If, like Sarah and Illuminate, you believe in the preservation and celebration of diverse Jewish histories and traditions, then you're in the right place today. After the conversation, we will open the floor for questions. Feel free to write your questions in the chat as you have them, or hold them and you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask later. For now, we are muting everyone in order to avoid background noise. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce the president of Illuminate, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. So happy to have you with us here today. And what a timely conversation as we've just celebrated Mizrahi Heritage Month. So well timed. Sarah, welcome. I'm so looking forward to chatting with you today. I think we should start, just to let everyone hear a little bit about your journey to Jemena. Tell us a little bit about your background and what's led you to this organization.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's such an honor to be a part of the Illuminate community. So I want to thank you, Rachel, and the entire staff and board of Illuminate for all of the great work that you guys are doing to elevate women leaders. I would be remiss. I see that Claudia Rodin is on this call, and she is a luminary Sephardic voice, leader, writer. I'm so honored that she's here. I'm having a major fangirl moment. So I couldn't start this without saying hello to Claudia. Anyways, a little bit about myself. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I grew up in a pretty traditional Jewish home. My father comes from a Sephardic Turkish background, and my mother is Ashkenazi. Her father was a Holocaust survivor, and that had probably the biggest impact on my passion and involvement in Jewish life. And I would say that growing up, I really only experienced my Sephardic heritage in my Nona and Papoon, my grandparents' home, with their siblings, my uncles, all of our extended family. I was very connected and very much in love with the foods that my Nona cooked, with the traditions, with the way we celebrated and had just joy together. But I never experienced my Sephardic heritage outside of that, with the exception of a Sephardic synagogue in Chicago that actually my great-grandparents helped to build. Like most of you have heard the word Ashkenormative. It's very true that historically Jewish institutions have been extremely Ashkenormative. So whenever I was in a mainstream Jewish synagogue or a Jewish overnight camp or any kind of Jewish program, what was always reflected back to me was Ashkenazi heritage. I never really understood what was missing from Jewish life until I was an undergraduate in college. This was during the days of the Second Intifada, right after 9/11. All of a sudden, I became this kind of unwilling voice and ambassador of Jewish people. Most of my friends on campus were not Jewish. In fact, many of my friends were Middle Eastern. I really understood at this point that American perceptions of who Jewish people are, where we come from, and how we arrived in the United States, why we arrived in the United States, were deeply flawed, because very few people, including Ashkenazi Jews, recognized or understood Sephardi history and why Jews came to the United States and what happened to Jews in the Middle East and North Africa in the 20th century. No one at the time in the United States spoke about the fact that more than half of Israel's Jewish population are Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. You can't understand Israel and the Middle East unless you know that. At the same time, when I was in college, I met Gina Bublil Waldman, who is one of the individuals co-founding the organization. She herself was a former Jewish refugee from Libya. Her entire community was ethnically cleansed from Libya in 1967. They fled with $20 and maybe a suitcase. Many of them faced extremely violent persecution in the days leading up to their expulsion. When I heard her story and I learned what the co-founders of Jemena were doing, I was immediately inspired and drawn to their work. When the organization began, it started really as an effort to create a platform for former Jewish refugees to share their personal stories. It wasn't political. It wasn't about bringing Sephardi heritage into schools. It was really a storytelling organization. And I felt at that phase in my life that that was a gap that this organization was going to fill. And I wanted to follow it. I wasn't super interested in other Jewish agencies and other areas of Jewish communal life. And I lived in Israel for a number of years. Throughout that time, I followed Jemena. I stayed up to date. I stayed connected. And then years later, when I returned, I started working professionally for Jemena.
That's amazing. I mean, and you talk about how its roots are in personal stories, right? And you yourself have your own personal story as a partially Sephardic, as a self-identifying both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jew. And so that your personal story can be represented in the work that you do is sort of a full circle kind of moment. You talk about the history of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, and Jemena has a terrific organizational video that I think could help us frame our conversation. Sure. So we'd like to play that now and then use that as a springboard to go from there.
Great.
Shalom, my name is Adiel Cohen, and I'm a Yemenite Jew from Israel.
Here I am in law school. My parents came here with not much, and I'm proud.
We're not just surviving, we're also thriving.
In the 20th century, close to 1 million Jewish refugees fled anti-Semitism and oppression in Arab countries and Iran. Today, their Mizrahi and Sephardi descendants make up more than half of Israel's Jewish population.
Mizrahi and Sephardic culture is huge.
The children and grandchildren of Jewish refugees from Arab countries and Iran are fighting for human rights and the heritage of their ancestors.
If you oppose Jews defining the hatred which we ourselves experience, you are in essence endorsing that very hatred.
My name is Isabella Hazan, and I am a proud Jew.
Jewish history without Mizrahi history is like a book missing half of its chapters. You can't tell the story without including us. You just can't. The story of Jewish life in the Middle East begins during the days of the Bible, more than 3,000 years ago, in the ancient kingdom of Judah. Its residents were known as Yehudim, which translates to the word Jews. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire forced the Jews out of Judah. Many settled in what would become modern-day Iraq and other countries in the Middle East and North Africa. They lived in those lands continuously until the 20th century, when they fled oppression and religious persecution.
During the time of the Holocaust, Nazi ideology really made its way into the Middle East. The Jews were in a very, very dire condition. They were basically refugees in their own homeland.
It's really heartbreaking to think of everything that happened to my grandmother. She can't forget the memories of how her dad was killed in Iraq and how she saw her best friend being raped and killed in the street of Iraq during the Farhud because she was Jewish.
By the 1950s, about 850,000 Jews who were kicked out of the Arab world. And a lot of historians will say, no, they weren't kicked out. Okay. 850,000 Jews where life was made so horrific for them that they had no choice but to leave the Arab world.
While some scattered to countries around the globe, 650,000 Jewish refugees poured into the young state of Israel.
The country had a really hard task to bring all these Jews from all over the world with different cultures, traditions, education all together.
When my grandparents came to Israel in 1951, they only had the clothes on their backs, and they lived in tents and in tin shacks for years in Ma'abarot, in the transit camps, those refugee camps that were set up in Israel for Mizrahi Jews. They had nothing.
Our ancestors chose to leave, and they chose to preserve our Jewish identity.
By keeping our traditions alive, we are not only keeping our ancestors alive, but we're keeping all their efforts that came before them. And that's like an honor that we can give to them.
Jimena. Jewish refugees from Libya and Egypt founded Jimena, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, to tell their stories and to keep their heritage alive.
So great. I think, you used the word Ashkenormative before, and for those who don't know, that's sort of like the idea that we sort of, mainstream American Jewry especially, sort of looks at everything through that lens, through the Ashkenazi lens, through Eastern Europe, through the Holocaust and what happened in Europe. And I think a lot of us don't actually know the history that happened in the Middle East at that time and how Middle Eastern Jews were affected. But this may feel rudimentary to some, but just so that we're all on the same page and using the same terminology and the same definitions and understanding the distinctions, can you define Sephardic and Mizrahi Judaism for us?
Sure. So I should say, I think it's a really important question, and there's really not a definitive answer to that for all different reasons. But generally, Sephardic is used to describe Jewish populations which originated in the Iberian Peninsula, and Jewish communities which identify as operating within the framework of Sephardic law and custom, which was the norm for Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and North Africa. The category, the word Mizrahi, emerged in Israel in the 20th century to refer to the Jewish immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa who were pouring into Israel at the time. It comes from the word Idota Mizrach, which means the communities from the East. And what is really interesting about that is if you look at a map, Morocco and other North African countries are actually farther to the west of Poland and Ukraine. So it's a really kind of newer term, and it's a loaded term. We at Jimena privilege self-identification, so people can identify however they want, and people do. Those words Sephardic and Mizrahi were not typically used by Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews to define themselves until this last 100 years or so. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews have very diverse backgrounds and languages and practices and skin colors and national origins. So these are really fluid categories. With regards to American racial and ethnic categories, some Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews identify as Jews of color, some as non-white, and some as white. So I hope that answers or clarifies.
You know, it's interesting. You know, that's it, in a way, it's really challenging, right? Because we've come up with these categories, as you're saying, for a really diverse population of people who may share some traditions and cultures, but may have completely differing. And it seems quite limiting, actually, to have just the two. Can you tell us a little bit from what you're seeing of how Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are being excluded from mainstream Jewish communities, both, you know, here in the US and Israel?
Yeah. So I'm just going to talk about the United States. I'm not going to talk about Israel.
Okay.
I think, well, first of all, this is a complicated question, and it's a very old question. And we know in North America that our Jewish communal institutions, or at least the Jewish communal institutions that we think of when we think about like the ecosystem of Jewish communal life, they were built by Ashkenazi Jews, and they reflect Ashkenazi culture and heritage and experience. Ashkenazi Jews are the dominant population of Jews in the United States. We are a minority. But there's a deeper answer to your question. There's a few deeper answers to your questions. And some of these issues are being fleshed out and researched right now by historians. But generally, when Sephardi Jews arrived in the United States in the 20th century, they were very intentionally and oftentimes excluded from Jewish communal life. There are all different reasons for this. And this is documented too, including some of our largest Jewish institutions. One major reason had to do with immigration quotas, US government immigration quotas, which allowed for more Northern Europeans to enter into the United States and then to really assimilate into whiteness. But this was not the case for Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who came from Southern Europe and the Middle East. They faced more restrictive immigration quotas, and many of them were, refused entry into the United States. And then when they came into the United States, many of them were not white. They spoke Middle Eastern languages. They spoke Italian. They spoke Ladino. They spoke Arabic. And what's been written about right now, actually, there's a great historian. His name is Dr. Levin. I encourage all of you to check out his work. I believe he's writing a book about this right now, is that Ashkenazi Jews they feared for their own stability and their own place in the United States by aligning and supporting Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews and identifying them as part of their own. They felt that they were subjecting themselves to discrimination and to being treated as others in the same way that Sephardi Mizrahi Jews were treated when they came to the United States. And then, of course, there's like the cultural divides, the language differences, the differences in demographics and size. I think that this history from the early 20th century just kind of slowly evolved into a Jewish communal system of ignorance and indifference. I don't think necessarily that there was, I don't know. I'm not a historian per se. I don't know that, those very clear boundaries persisted. But what I do know, what is absolutely certain is that, yes, while Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are welcomed into Jewish spaces, into Ashkenormative spaces, historically and up until today, there's kind of this unspoken condition of having to leave your Jewish heritage, some of your ideological differences at the door. If you want to assimilate into Jewish spaces, you have to assimilate into Ashkenazi American Jewish frameworks. What we've seen is that Sephardi heritage is kind of treated as a nice dessert, like a nice add-on to regularly scheduled programs. And that has allowed for some serious like cherry picking and tokenizing of Sephardi Mizrahi Jews and customs. I think there's like a real need to kind of start flipping some of the language on its head. There's this perception that certain Sephardi communities are extremely insular, not wanting to participate in mainstream Jewish life. And that may be true, but maybe it's because they weren't welcome when they came here. And maybe there was a need to build our own institutions and our own synagogues. My great-grandparents, when they came to the United States from Turkey, they had to build their own community. They built a synagogue. They built a kehillah that still exists today. And, I think there have been difficult choices that a lot of Sephardic Mizrahi Jews have had to make regarding holding on to traditions and heritage and community, or assimilating into the mainstream. Our Jewish communal institutions did not start where they are today, which is thinking about diverse, inclusive, equitable spaces. So I think recently, within the last few years, there's this major shift, a long overdue shift that's happening in Jewish institutional life, where mainstream institutions recognize that not all Jews are white and Ashkenazi, and things are starting to change. But these are really systemic problems that go back to the early 20th century. It's going to take a lot to make the kinds of changes that will enable Sephardi, Mizrahi, and diverse Jews to maintain their full selves, our full heritage in mainstream communal spaces. So it's fraught, it's complicated. And I hope that's not alienating anyone on this call that I'm sharing this, because it's not easy to hear this. But again, before I finish with this one thing, I highly recommend that everyone check out the work of Dr. Levin. He's a chair of Sephardic Studies at the Strom Center of International Studies at the University of Washington, and he's a leading Sephardi historian who focuses on Sephardi life in North America.
Yeah. And I think it's important for us to consider the lens which we move through the world, and how there are others who move through the world differently, and that, that maybe the space needs to be shared, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But we had a listener who wrote in a question just to follow up on what you were talking about, how many Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews had to create their own communities and their own spaces. How common was that in the early 20th century for those communities to be starting their synagogues? And was that a norm that people would have to create because they couldn't find what they needed?
Yeah. I think my family is a perfect example of this. I think when Jews came from the Middle East and North Africa, they brought their own unique traditions and practices. And Sephardi Jews are non-denominational. There's no Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. There's just Judaism. There's just being Jewish. And I think there were language barriers. There was a lot of difference between the way Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews practiced and built Jewish community spaces. And Sephardi Jews did build synagogues that continue today. And it's not even Sephardi Jews as like one flat group of people. If you go into like an Iranian synagogue, it is very different than going into like a French North African synagogue. So Sephardic Jews built their own institutions, their own synagogues, and many of them didn't want to go into they didn't necessarily want to go into an Ashkenazi. My great-grandparents had zero interest in going into an Ashkenazi space. They were interested in building their own communities. But I think what happened, and what continues to happen, is that because we are the minority, Sephardi Mizrahi Jews there's just less of us.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of intermarriage, and there's been a lot of assimilating into the mainstream. And that has meant that many Jewish people my age and younger, and even older than me, have really lost touch with what it means to be a Sephardic Jew and what Sephardic practice is. And I think, we know the stories, but the ancient heritage, it's a little more challenging to retain some of that.
Yeah. And what would you say that mainstream American Jewish organizations are losing by excluding this population of people?
Well, I think, first of all, what's being lost is an understanding of who we as a Jewish people are, and from the ancient Middle East up until today, where we all historically come from, how we lived in the Middle East and North Africa, and some of the ancient Jewish practices that should be carried into the future that continued on in the Middle East are kind of, at least in the United States, kind of going by the wayside. Ties to the Middle East and North Africa are not ephemeral for Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. They live there continuously for thousands of years. And there's also a richness and a relevancy to how Sephardic Jews lived between like 1492, which is the year the Spanish Inquisition started, and today, that can help our communities create a Jewish communal future that is adaptable and flexible and human-centered and uncompromisingly Jewish at its core. I think what most people don't really understand is that Sephardic Judaism is really human focused. It's always been the Sephardic Chachamim, which means our sages, the Sephardic sages from the Middle East and North Africa, many of them, not all, obviously it's very diverse, had a way of leading that was first and foremost focused on the needs of individuals and communities. And that trumped the religious dogma and divide that we see emerging after the Jewish Reformation in Europe. So I think there's a lot of ancient wisdom that our rabbis still have and try and share that has been lost, and that can really help us in this moment as we're grappling with issues of building diverse, inclusive, human-centered communities. And then just putting it in like very modern terms, we can sit around as Jews and talk about intersectionality all day, but that conversation is really incomplete and dishonest if we fail to recognize that so many Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, particularly those that came here, like Jimena's co-founders, they sit at the intersection of Middle Eastern life and Jewish life. Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews can help the Jewish communal world build a deeper relationship and a better understanding of Israel and the Middle East that's really Middle Eastern. It's completely authentically Middle Eastern. In my opinion, Middle Eastern Sephardic Mizrahi Jews should not only be at interfaith tables and tables related to Arab-Jewish relations, they should be sitting at the heads of those tables. And they're not. And that is really a missed opportunity politically, socially, culturally, in every way you can think of.
I agree. I agree with you. I think that's true. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that Jimena is doing to sort of progress Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews in participation in mainstream Jewry. And I know also recently Jimena was a recipient of a major reset grant from the Jewish Community Response and Impact Fund. And for those of you who don't know, these were multi-million-dollar grants given by a consortium of some of the largest Jewish funders in the US, and they were designed to advance big ideas to reset the Jewish community. And congratulations to you on receiving one. How is that, tell us a little bit about your work and how that grant has helped to advance your work.
Okay, so we did receive a JCRIF grant, and we're so grateful for that. It really was an investment, not just in Jimena, but in Sephardic leaders throughout the United States. The first part of that work is to launch a demographic study of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish Americans. Sephardi Jews were the first Jews to come to the United States, yet up until today, and as we approach 2023, there has never been a demographic study of our communities. So we don't even, and because of that, we don't have language. That's why I say early on, when you asked me to define it, there hasn't been any effort to build consensus around language. And part of that is because we don't have any data on our communities. We can guess all we want, but there is no data on who we are, where we come from, how we identify, all these, demographic factors. So that study is being led by Dr. Michal Biton. She's a scholar in residence at the Hartman Institute. She's a sociologist who wrote a PhD on Syrian Jewish communities in New York. She's wonderful. So that's the first component of the study. And the second component of the study was to build out an institute for leadership development opportunities for Sephardic Jews, and then also for educating the larger Jewish community on Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. So we've already been doing that, the third piece of that, which is educating the larger community. But this is really to kind of formalize that work, specifically as it relates to lifting up the voices of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish leaders. There's been such a lack of investment and attention towards all of these synagogues and rabbis and activists and amazing scholars and leaders, and people have been doing this work unrecognized, unknown, underfunded for years. And the hope is that the JCRIF grant will allow us to create spaces in partnership with these leaders for them to share their knowledge and their wisdom and their recommendations. So we just completed the first year of the grant, and that was kind of getting everything in place, which we've done. And now we'll be able to start pushing the work forward. One really great program through the Sephardic Leadership Institute that actually existed a year prior, it was piloted here in San Francisco. I encourage all of you to check it out if you're interested, because we bring in lay leaders and practitioners. It's called our Sephardic Leaders Fellowship. And it's basically a learning fellowship. So it's an opportunity to take a deep dive into Sephardi Mizrahi topics and issues that are relevant to us today in 2022.
That's amazing. And maybe one of our Illuminate staff can pop a link to that in the chat so that if people are interested, that they can check it out.
Yeah.
You had mentioned to me that Jimena is also working to create a larger international movement to promote the rights of Sephardic Jews. And can you talk a little bit about that work and what you're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so we did not start that work, and we can't take credit for that work at all. There was an organization that emerged in the 1970s called I'm blinking on the name. It was an institution that was created to pursue redress and acknowledgement for the 1 million Jewish refugees. And there have been offshoots in different projects that have emerged since then. But as we all know, we didn't grow up hearing about the ethnic cleansing of North African Jews. And that ethnic cleansing meant that Jews from the Middle East and North Africa left, in today's value, hundreds of billions of dollars behind. Properties that were confiscated, personal properties, everything you can think of, from hospitals to Jewish day schools to homes. These were communities that were not impoverished. They had thousands of years of building communal and individual wealth in the region, and it was taken from them when they left, or they were forced to sell their properties at, minimal value. So some of the properties that have been stolen or confiscated are sacred manuscripts and Torah scrolls and everything you can think of, from like a menorah to a ketubah. Very little of those materials were allowed out. And these are the lands that Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, emerged from. So this is the Jewish patrimony of all of us. This is not just Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish patrimony. This is our Jewish patrimony. We've been involved, Jimena has been mostly involved in campaigns to protect this cultural property and to push policies and attention and awareness forward, to get our larger institutions also to make this a priority area for them. I don't need to get too into the weeds with any of it. I'm happy to.
No, but I think that's really important, and I'm sure some of this people don't realize.
Yeah.
I'm going to invite anyone who has questions. I'm going to have everyone mute themselves. But I'm going to invite anyone who has a question to either put it in the chat or to use the hand raise function. And while people are thinking about what they might want to ask, I want to ask you a little bit about your experience being part of the collective and how you feel it's impacted your leadership and how you've leveraged the relationships that you've made within it.
Sure. So I was thinking about how to answer this question, but because this is a community of women, I'm just going to go say straight, I'm going to get right to it. Aside from being in a cohort with phenomenal women whose work I respect and being connected to this larger network of amazing women and visionaries, there have been some extremely poignant conversations amongst my cohort related to ageism and women entering middle age and growing, and not just ending their careers when they're in their 30s and 40s. And the challenges that we all face as we grow as women, as we become wiser and older, and all of these amazing milestones that we should be celebrating, and how we are forced to grapple with them in ways that are depreciating and insulting, actually. So those conversations, which I didn't even bring, I wasn't even thinking about them, I've benefited so much from, and I've appreciated them. Having a really honest, safe space to talk about these types of challenges with other practitioners has been invaluable for me. So that has been the number one way. I mean, I could like say all the wonderful glossy things, like receiving grant money has been a tremendous gift, but really it's those heart-to-heart conversations about some of the most challenging issues we face as women has been the most valuable for me.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes leaders, and especially women leaders, don't really have the space or feel that they have the space to be vulnerable. And in another conversation, one of our jewels talked about vulnerability as an asset to leadership. And so I think we at Illuminate feel proud to be able to create a space where people can bring that vulnerability and lean on and learn from, you know, the expertise and support of others. I think that that's something that we cherish. I see a lot of hands up. I'm going to start with some new faces. And forgive me if I mispronounce anyone's name. Is it Rin? Great, Rin.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Rin Silverstein. I'm the community manager at Haggadot.com and love your work, Jimena. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations of folks who are, say, ritualist creatives who would be great to talk to, who are Sephardi and Mizrahi, who we could reach out to and feature in our community.
Yeah, so I am happy to share names. I think we have amazing Sephardic rabbis that are really underutilized. Rabbi Daniel Buskila, he is kind of like our in-house rabbi. But I'd say if there was like a chief rabbi of Sephardic Jews, at least in the West Coast, he would be given that title. I think right now the Jewish communal world is at like this unique juncture where we're kind of creating new Judaisms, but we have these amazing, amazing spiritual leaders. There's also a wonderful woman named Tzipora Gabay. She's a rabbi here in the Bay Area. She's of Moroccan lineage, and she comes from a lineage of rabbis. She's wonderful. She's an educator. I'm happy to connect separately and share names with you.
Amazing.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can all think about, we have a few months to prepare how we might include some Sephardic or Mizrahi traditions in our Seder. So thank you, Rin, and that's terrific. Paul, I see your hand.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that my synagogue in New York, the Brotherhood, sponsored a showing of the Forgotten Refugees about 15 years ago with, I believe, your predecessor, whose name I can't recall at the moment. So there is awareness of your organization. Some of the points that you've recounted today, I could relate to through my own personal experience in a pretty, not statistically historical manner, but just anecdotally. About 15 years ago, I started doing genealogical research in my own family. I'm completely Ashkenazi by, my heritage so far as ever I knew. But when I started to take DNA tests, it started to come back with some minor, but not insignificant recognition of heritage that ran all the way from the Iberian Peninsula into Iran. And over the last 15 years, what I've noticed is that those percentages have slowly gone down and my Ashkenazi heritage has gone up. So I haven't changed my stripes. It's how people look at these things. And if you look at the sites of, say, like Ancestry.com, the area by which they describe what is Ashkenazi has actually expanded by thousands of square miles in that time. And so rather than consider someone from northern Spain or Italy as being Sephardic or Mizrahi, they have slowly aggregated those people into Ashkenazim. And I think that is partly because some of the phenomena that you recounted here in America that's been happening with Sephardim and Mizrahim coming and being integrated into Ashkenazi society had already been occurring in Europe for hundreds of years before. Most people are aware of the Inquisition people going from Spain and Portugal into the Netherlands and also to England, but there was a tremendous infusion of Sephardim and Mizrahim coming in through the Ottoman Empire holdings around the Black Sea in the 16, 17, and 1800s, which really comes up as close to even great-grandparents for many people who are still alive today. And so what I would suggest is that if you can make more of the Ashkenazi population aware of the fact that they probably, many people who are Ashkenazim have Sfardim and Mizrahim in their family heritage, but it has become diffused over periods of hundreds of years. I found by going through town records, there's an organization called Jewish Gen, Gen, all one word, .org, which is a fantastic organization that has literally millions of records online available for research. One can look through marriage records in Lithuania and find that, you know, a man is referred to as a Sephardic, or that they say where he's from. And that person who got absorbed in a marriage in Lithuania to a Lithuanian woman, you know, in 1825, they become lost in the drop in the ocean. I'm done.
I really appreciate your comments, and I agree that we would do well to all kind of look into our histories and recognize that all of us have some Middle Eastern DNA in our bodies for sure. But I want to make sure there's a lot of hands up, so I want to keep moving along, but I really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Paul. Barbara Pollard.
Sarah, this is an amazing talk. Thank you so much. It's very informative. I just have a question. You were talking about ways of defining New Judaism. Has there been an overlap with Jews of color, given your group?
Yes, because there are some Sephardi Mizrahi Jews who identify as Jews of color, and they are part of the Jews of Color initiatives. But there's also this thing that's happened quite frequently these last few years, where there's kind of this like flattening, where all diverse Jews, all Jews who are non-white and Ashkenazi, are kind of clumped together in these very broad umbrella categories. And by doing so, it sort of erases our unique needs, the uniqueness that all of our diverse communities bring to the table, and sort of just kind of puts us in this one category as other. In some ways, that feels like we're being erased even more. I think there's definitely overlap in what we're fighting for and what we're striving for and what we're demanding. And we do certainly support each other's work and work together. But I would say that we all have, all institutions, including even amongst the Jews of color, there's so much diversity. There's so many unique institutions. We're all doing different work. We're supporting each other and collaborating in certain spaces and like going between different spaces. But our focus, Jimena's focus, is Sephardi Mizrahi Jews of all races, regardless if they're white, black, you know, whatever the background, whatever your ethnic or racial backgrounds are.
Thank you. Michelle Horowitz, it's wonderful to see you here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having this amazing series. Sarah, you are incredible. I have one of my questions was kind of like digging a little deeper in what you just said. I'm just curious if there's tension between Ashkenazi Jews of color and like them, and then Mizrahi Sephardic Jews of color being, like you said, being erased, or like wanting to be part of mainstream Ashkenazi Jewish culture, but not lose. So I'm just wondering if there's tension there between Ashkenazi Jews of color and Sephardic Mizrahi Jews generally. And then my other question, I'm sorry to ask this, but I'm just very curious. Is there a specific reason that you can share with us as to why you aren't going to speak about Israel?
I'm not going to speak about Israel because, first of all, I'm American. Even though I lived in Israel for a number of years, I even have an Israeli passport. I don't feel that I am a representative voice of Israeli Jews. I'm, very unapologetically a Zionist. If you look or read anything that I've written, you'll learn that pretty quickly. And Israel is a whole other bag of worms. So I don't, the issues there, the social construct, the societal issues, is just very, very different than what Sephardi Mizrahi Jews are facing in the United States. In terms of tensions, I don't think there's tensions. I think we support each other. I think what we recognize as difference, our communities have different needs. Black Jews have to contend with racism, with with structural racism in the United States. Our communities have dealt with different issues. I think we support anti-racism. Our communities support anti-racism work. I don't think that there's tension. I think we're really kind of mutually supporting and cheerleading for each other.
Thank you. Efrat, I know you asked a question in the chat, and it might be what you want to talk about regarding curriculum resources. And someone else also wrote to me, maybe, and I don't know if this will, but that Jimena has some ethnic studies curriculum, so maybe that we can touch on that. But let's see what your question is with your hand raised.
Sure. Thank you. Again, fascinating, and thank you so much. So I work at a very Ashkenazi type Jewish day school in LA, but that's not but we have demographics of Jews who come to our school who are coming from many different backgrounds, and I feel that they are not represented in the culture of our school, and I'm truly trying to bring upon changes so we can see the beautiful tapestries and colors and our Jewish people. So as a person who's trying to put this curriculum together, I can tell you using the internet or other resources is not very helpful yet. And so I am calling to Jimena to make, not complaining, not complaints, just asking to help us become stronger in the way to reach out to our parents, to our rabbis, to our leaders of the school, in order to include more, so we can respect the different backgrounds.
Thank you, Efrat.
Thank you, Ifra. I really, really, really appreciate that, because that seems like it's a really actionable, practical thing that all of us who are involved in Jewish education spaces can do. And I agree and echo everything that you are saying. We did create a curriculum called Journey to the Mizrach. I put it in the chat. And within that curriculum, if you go into the resource section, you'll see a list of all other Sephardi Mizrahi curricula that are out there. This is actually a big focus area of our work. We just held a 2-day conference called Journey to the Mizrach, and we had different speakers from all over the world talk about Sephardi education issues and opportunities and needs. And the videos are online. You can watch them from the talk. The curriculum is free and it's online. And within the Sephardic Leadership Institute that I mentioned before as part of the JCRIF grant, we actually have an educators committee. And our hope is that within this next year, they're going to be writing kind of a guide and a toolkit for Jewish day schools to help them as they work to integrate Sephardi content into the classroom. One of the big problems that we have is that there's many challenges, many challenges. But like you say, there's not a great deal out there. And I think a lot of this is going to need to come from parents and schools. And we've also, like you mentioned, Rachel, worked in public education spaces. And I'm really proud that Jimena was leading the helm in the California ethnic studies fights. We produced a lesson plan on anti-Semitism that centered Sephardi Mizrahi experiences. And that was actually adopted by the state of California into their ethnic studies, social studies framework. It was the first time that the state of California adopted materials on Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. And that's pretty monumental. I mean, we have the largest public school system in the United States. And it was such a hard fight, but a really, really important one. If our public schools can do it, then our Jewish schools must do it.
Amazing. Do you have plans to roll that out in other states or to try and advocate for other states?
I mean, it's not easy. It was a very hard process, and it's a fraught process, as we all know. Fights in education, specifically as it relates to disciplines like ethnic studies, are growing and bubbling, and they're really challenging, and it requires a degree of advocacy work that we just don't have the capacity to do. But what we have done, and what I offer to all of you and to every other Jewish institution, is that we can give you the tools and the support, we can give you the content, we can give you the experts, we can give you the voices, so you can do it yourself.
Amazing. Amazing. We have time for 2 more quick questions. Betsy Landis, hi. You're on mute.
You're muted, Betsy.
Sorry. Okay. Those of us who grew up in New York always learned that the first Jews in New York were from Brazil and Portugal, I think, and were, I guess, Portugal would be Sephardic. I'm not sure where the Jews in Brazil came from. But is there anything that we can learn from the transition from their being the leaders and the pioneers to the influx of the Ashkenazi who took over?
I'm not quite sure I understand. Like, is there anything,
as other than the one person you mentioned, who's I hope you'll put his name in the
Levin.
Yeah. Does anybody done research, PhD research and so forth on that period and that group?
Yeah. So, and what I'm happy to do, I can put it in the chat. Jimena has a bibliography of, like, it's kind of insane how long our bibliography is, but I would recommend checking it out because you may see some titles that look interesting to you. There hasn't been a great deal of research on Sephardic Jews in the United States, unfortunately. There's been some, but not a lot. But you know, you're in New York, you could just go to the Statue of Liberty and read the poem by Emma Lazarus. Like, I feel like that is,
of course.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that. I'll put the bibliography in the chat. I also put the link to the curriculum in the chat.
And also know that the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue still calls their president and still uses the Spanish or I guess Latino terminology.
Yeah.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You're listed here as Archives. Maybe you can introduce yourself when you take yourself off mute.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm from the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of Montreal.
Great.
And we are very relevant to our discussion here. After the ethnic cleansing of the Arab lands and Iran, they just kept coming and coming and coming. And our 40-year Rabbi Emeritus, Zichrono Livracha, Howard Joseph, integrated everybody. And so if you go to Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, you find a different hall for each of our, one is Iraqi, one is Moroccan, one is Lebanese, one is Ashkenazi, and we even have an Ethiopian contingent. So my father was imprisoned in Evin prison, and we are originally from Basra in Iraq, and his father built 2 Jewish schools in Iran, and we are of the Babylonian community, the Iraqi Jewish community of Tehran. And so he was in prison because he had a factory and they wanted it. And you see what's going on in Iran right now. And kudos to the women, as you are over here. That's, if you want to get something done, ask a woman. So my dad told me that he's writing a memoir of his time in the prison while he was actually translating the Hebrew Bible to his cellmates and given them so much hope. And so he organized these speaker events. Everybody had a chance to speak about something, so they would take turns. Anyway, he wrote a beautiful book, which I edited and co-wrote. And I really think that this can be a bridge builder because he was one.
Well,
So,
thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Will you pop a link to it in the chat so that people who are interested can check it out?
Sure. It's
Okay,
very uplifting, short and sweet, and I think it can bring us all together because at Mount Sinai, there were no Orthodox or conservative. We were all one, and it's time that we recognize that today.
Thank
So
you so much.
there's something wrong with my, technically it's called, if you can type it in, there's something wrong with my, because I'm outside of Canada right now. It's called The Book,
Okay.
A Humble Quest into the Hebrew Scriptures.
Okay, we'll have someone look it up and pop it in. Thank you very much. We're
God
running out
bless
of
you.
time. Sarah, I want to leave us with sort of like one last question for people to take away. But, you know, creating inclusive Jewish communities and any inclusive communities is a responsibility that we all share. So what are some action items that listeners here can undertake to help create more inclusive communities?
Yeah, I think that first of all, recognizing ideological difference can be a strength, at least when it comes to Sephardi Mizrahi Jews. And I think, like, you know, we've heard about this, we've talked about this a lot. You need to make sure you have staff, board members, that you are really building an institution internally that is inclusive and representative of the great diversity in the Jewish community. And then I think I think a lot of times there's been a tendency to kind of, I don't want to say silence, it's not the right word, but I think a lot Sephardi Mizrahi Jews have had to like adopt a different language and approach when working, and it's really uncomfortable. It's not natural. Welcoming authentic voices as they are and allowing them to share in a proud way. I think it happens sometimes it doesn't. And then in terms of like action items that we can all do at home, I learned from you, Rachel, that right now Illuminate's focused on refugees, that's going to be one of the main issues. So there's a beautiful Hanukkah tradition that I learned about from a rabbi here in California many years ago that is adopted by the Syrian Jews. And I remember participating in a service that he led during the Syrian civil war when Syrians were just fleeing en masse. And that is amongst Syrian Jews up until today, they light an extra Hanukkah candle every night. And that extra Hanukkah candle is to remember and honor the safe passage of their Sephardic ancestors from Spain to Syria as a way to give thanks. And I think doing that, with like holding in our minds the fact that so many people don't have homes, that there are so many refugees around the world, and that we are safe as a way to say thank you. There's lots of different action items, there's a lot we can do, but I think obviously not just talking about building diverse spaces, but like allowing Sephardic Jews to actually talk about what that means for them, and making sure that they're not just like included as an afterthought, but they're included in the building process is critical.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you.
It was great. And I know that Rachel's going to maybe share some other action items as well.
Yes, thank you for that. The one that you just shared was going to go in the email tomorrow, so you will receive some more action items tomorrow.
And Kim, I want to thank you. I didn't thank you for sharing your personal story. Those stories are like critical, and I'm really grateful that you spoke up and shared. Thank you.
Yes, agreed. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who shared their story and their questions. And thank you especially to Sarah and to Rachel for leading us in this conversation. I know I learned so much, and it sounds like the listeners did too. So please look in your email tomorrow for some follow-up action items, and mark your calendar for our next Crown Jewel conversation on Thursday, January 5th with Esti Shushan from Niv Charot in Israel. Another very interesting story, different population. So we hope you'll all join us. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you for all the work that you do, Jimena.
Thank you. Thank you.
Happy Hanukkah. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.